Hello everyone, welcome to Books in the World, a production of the Cape Cod Writers Center. I'm Madeline Holt and I'm delighted to be here today with Joanne Parsons. Hi Joanne.
Hi.
Nice to have you. We are going to talk about Irish history in terms of the early years when Irish immigrants came to Boston. The book is Kitchen Canary, which is Joanne's first book. We're going to talk about first novels, and also her second book, Through the Open Door, has just come out. So we have a lot of interesting things to talk about today. The book is a kind of romantic historical fiction with good guys, bad guys, and heroes and heroines, and a lot of interesting social issues that many people don't know about. I want to read a quote from one of your Amazon reviewers, and you've got all good ones, I'm happy to say, and you I'm probably glad to know. But here we go. Buckle your seatbelts for an emotional journey back to the years following the Civil War, a tale of an Irish immigrant coming to America, Boston, to discover slavery still existed and she had become a kitchen canary. So, without giving away the plot, I recommend reading Kitchen Canary, and I expect this won't be the last time we hear from Miss Parsons. Good job, lady. So, isn't that fun to get that? That is really fun. So, right off the top, before we get into the details, and what we're going to talk about is what is a kitchen canary, among other things, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to write this book.
Oh, I actually retired from a career in elder care, and in the end of 2015, I had been recently widowed and spent my first winter in Florida. And I joined a writers group as a way to reach out. And I wrote a short story for the writers group that was based on my grandfather's birth story. And he was the product of the kitchen canary and the master of the house.
Aha, okay.
And the people in the writers group said to me, "You've got a book here." And so I followed up and immersed myself in writing the book.
Well, so some of your reviewers and myself didn't know this story. It's not as common as you would think. I would have thought by now that the stories of the Irish immigrants would be well known. Not so, not really. So what is a kitchen canary?
Well, again, my aunt told me the story, and she said your grandfather was the product of a kitchen canary and the master of the house. And the kitchen canary was the Irish domestic. And it was common in those days, and we're still facing the Me Too movement, where abuse of power took place, and the master of the house took advantage of the Irish domestic.
So backtracking in history a little bit, first of all, what are the years that the book is set? Well,
the Irish immigrant, Katie O'Neill, leaves Ireland in 1868 to immigrate to Massachusetts to be an Irish domestic.
Okay.
And the book runs about 4 years.
Okay, now she was coming from poverty. I think it might help everyone to give us a little bit of a review of what was going on in Ireland in the 1840s, 50s.
In the 1840s into the 50s, there was the late 40s, there was the Irish potato famine, and a lot of the Irish who were working fairly successfully on their farms for the English lost everything during the famine because their main product was potatoes. And Ireland didn't really, many Irish left Ireland at that time and began the immigration to America and other countries. In 1868, where I start Kitchen Canary, poverty was still rampant in Ireland. People were still starving to death. The economy had not recovered well enough, and there was another famine going on. And so the Irish have faced many famines and many disasters and many downtrodden economic times. And that resulted in so many Irish coming to America.
Well, the irony is that your main character comes here to be a domestic, but she comes from a situation that doesn't lead her to this job very easily. I'm going to reach down here and grab some pictures, which you told me you take to your book signings and things like that. showing the kind of situation that people lived in, like a thatched cottage and sleeping living quarters on, oh, this is on the ship.
This is on the
ship.
coffin ships. Yeah.
Right. But hearth in a two-room thatched cottage. This one, I think, has a dirt floor. Yeah. So she didn't know much about housework.
No, she wasn't.
Not in a Beacon Hill kind of townhouse situation.
Right. In Ireland, when the economy was so bad, which was most of the time in that era, there was training for women who were more in the urban, more in the city sections, to become domestic. So they had formal training on making beds and sort of the modern things that they would experience as domestics in America. But my character, Katie O'Neill, didn't have that training. She lived in a thatched cottage and didn't know anything about outdoor plumbing or toilets or washing dishes or sweeping floors or making beds. She slept on a pile of straw at night. Her cousin Mara sent for her. Her cousin Mara was an Irish domestic and sent for her, and they both were very backward in their ability to be true Irish domestics.
Well, one of the interesting plot twists, and we won't go into that, is the lady of the house was able to get them over there in the first place because, and I just found the way you weave all this together is very interesting, because the master of the house, the bad guy, the villain, he had Negroes, black domestic workers. Can you explain why he liked them better and how that all came about?
He was an Englishman, and he was definitely the power in the couple. And when his wife asked for help, he told her, "Don't bring any harps or mix into my house. This Englishman won't have them in my house." The English thought of the Irish as just less than animal-like, and so he did not want them in his home. He did have an escaped slave, a gentleman, William, who escaped slavery through the Underground Railroad and came to live with Mr. Brennan several years earlier, and he was his cook and sort of the home caretaker. And Mr. Brennan preferred William because William was desperate for a home and submissive, and Mr. Brennan liked that.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you have any idea how many freed blacks were in Boston around that time? Was this common?
Well, it was after
the Civil War.
1868 was after the Civil War, and a lot of freed blacks tried to make their way north. But they encountered the same issues that the immigrants were encountering. The economy wasn't good, and the white people, established white people, saw immigrants and blacks coming from the north as a threat to their jobs and their economy. So they were rejected not only for being former slaves, but also because if they were to take the white people's jobs, that was a big threat to the white population.
Now, Mr. Brennan, you said he was an Englishman. Now, when I hear he's an Englishman, that makes it sound like he's got some high position in life. Tell us his story in brief, and then we'll talk about how you developed his character. But just to give us a little outline of what happened to him. How did he come to be Mr. Brennan, the Englishman?
Well, he was a child of the London streets, and as the book will say, he didn't remember his mother. He remembered his name was Charles, and what his memory of his mother was the smell of whiskey. And he was an abandoned child in the streets of London. And he was brought into a home, an orphanage, and eventually, which happened during this era, he was shipped to Canada to work as a ranch hand, as a slave basically, to the ranchers, the English ranchers in Canada. And because he was abused on the way over and a tough kid, he decided he wasn't going to be a slave to a rancher, and he escaped and made his way to Vermont, and that's, his character started to develop there.
So he became wealthy. He became an antique dealer. How did that become about?
When he went to Vermont, he studied under a gentleman I named Mr. Hasty to learn how to make furniture. And as he studied, he learned all the nuances of furniture making and all the terms that were used. And he learned the maker's mark so he could recognize an expensive piece of furniture versus a cheaply made piece of furniture. And he began delivering Mr. Hasty's furniture to Boston because at the time, the Boston Brahmins were giving up their stuffy furniture that they had brought with them years back and starting to be more modern. And what Mr. Brennan would do would deliver furniture and then offer to take the stuffy old furniture away for the client, and he would save that. He rented a little storefront and would save all that furniture, and he studied it. And he would take a beautiful framed sofa that had no upholstery left on it and take the upholstery from another sofa and reupholster it. So he would make it into something beautiful and something that he considered a wonderful possession and may be valuable if he were to sell it.
You know, I could go on and on about this because I once lived on Beacon Hill, and I remember going into the antique shops, and I never imagined that those things were given up by people who wanted more modern things.
Right.
I guess I could have put that together, but you must have done some good research too. How much time did you spend researching this book?
I probably spent a year. Someone asked me where I write, and I said on my couch, and researched the history of the Irish famine and the history of Boston during the era of 1868, this post-Civil War era, and healthcare, because the book covers some of that. I learned some things from reading books about writing. For instance, the address was 2102 Beacon Street, and one of the things I read was to use things that are familiar to you. And 2102 was my father's badge number. He was an MBTA bus driver, and his number was 2102. And there really is no 2102 in Boston.
I'm trying to remember how far down Beacon Street 2102 would be.
It's not there. I wouldn't do that to
you wouldn't do that. We have some books here that you brought. I'm just going to mention them briefly in case people are interested in knowing more about the history of the Irish. You've got A City So Grand, The Rise of an American Metropolis in Boston, 1850 to 1900 by Stephen Puleo. And then The Boston Political Irish History, The Boston Irish A Political History. Thomas O'Connor, is he a well-known person in our history? Our meaning Boston history?
I'm not sure.
Okay. He's a professor of history at Boston College, so some people listening might recognize that name.
I researched books about Irish politics and about the Irish economy, the American economy in this era.
So we're going to jump around a little bit. People who want to read a good read and like romance and like history, no problem. This is a great story. In fact, tell us a little bit about the feedback that you got.
My feedback, it's the best part about writing, is when it's a little scary to write and then put it out there to other people, but it's been very rewarding to hear. Many themes have come up. Several people have emailed me and told me, thank you for helping me love reading again, which was most heartening.
That really is great. I know, I read it and the thing, this is really fun to read. You know?
Well, if you haven't been reading in a long time, it's an easy book to read, and the characters are very real, and that's another comment I got. I get a lot is how real the characters are. And what I've learned so much history that we didn't get taught in school. So many people have told me they wish they could thank their grandparents for their sacrifice, and that their grandparents never talked about it. And the more you read about what immigrants went through, they went through a lot of hardship, and yet we don't hear they don't tell us their story.
And you know, when they're gone, you can't ask them any longer.
No.
So if you still have grandparents, talk to them. You know? So on the process of becoming an author, and you came up with 6 main characters at least, all very interesting, and we can talk about Mr. Brennan's wife, Rose. And Mr. Brennan, though, I find him, he's the villain, and how did you grapple with how much humanity to give him versus making him the real bad guy, you know?
I thought a lot about it, and wanted to give people an understanding of how he could come to be so greedy and so willing to abuse people and not have any conscience about it. So I developed his character as someone who had never been loved, and he didn't understand relationships or loving except his possessions, and so he was more taken with his possessions than he was with other human beings. So he was able to do that. But that also makes him a sympathetic character, because he was never loved. And even when he met and married Rose, it wasn't a loving relationship. So he wasn't looking for love. It wasn't something that was, you know, something he understood, that he even needed, I think.
Well, then your other characters, more or less, they spend most of this book rescuing the girls from the situation that they're in, which was very prevalent, according to you, not only in this kind of household situation, but a lot of street problems, prostitution, poverty. Your other 2 characters, Moira and Patty, they had a sense of the needs of the Irish, and they were starting to be the social organizers of the time. Just say a few things about them.
Well, Patty, again, and this was common in the era, Patty was an infant who was left at the doorstep of the parish priest and never knew who his parents were. And it was assumed when an infant was abandoned that it was a prostitute who couldn't keep the child and would leave it with the priest. And so Patty had to make an identity for himself, and he needed to be worthwhile. And so he did things that made him a hero. He joined the fire department when it was very early that Irish were accepted on the fire and police, but he was among the first. And he would help the priest, to Father Mark. When Father Mark received infants, Patty would take the wagon and drive the infants to the orphanage in Lowell. Again, he would do things that were heroic to boost his own ego, because he really had no one, he had no identity, so he had to make one of his own, and he made himself a hero.
Well, we've talked about a lot of the characters. We haven't talked about Katie, and Katie really is the heroine of the book, and reminds me of a question we were talking about earlier about writing romance fiction. Would you call this a romance?
Sometimes I think about it that way, except I don't want to categorize it that way too much, because men have enjoyed reading the book as well. Lots of men have enjoyed it because they love the historical facts. I put little-known historical facts in every chapter. That was very important for me to thread that through, and people have commented that it's like a history lesson. They're learning things they didn't know about. And I think men love to hate Charles Brennan. I get a lot of comments that they really don't like him. And so but it is full of romance. It is full of people loving each other and kind of love prevailing, good prevailing over evil.
That's true. I was wondering about that. Is that something that really has to happen in a romance? That there's a genre there that you have to have your love story, and you have to have at least a hint that everything's going to work out well, even if you don't give it all away. And in your case, you have a sequel. So
I do.
I have a feeling that as much as things were kind of sewn up pretty nicely in the first book, that there were some loose ends. So
one of my sisters were my beta readers, and one of them commented that Patty is too good. And I'm so glad she commented, because I wrote a chapter in his voice, and he realized that he had been making himself the hero, the fireman and the saver of infants. But when Mara, his wife, was despairing over her issues, he distanced himself from her. And he had a recollection in the book that he was selfish and that he was more concerned with building his own reputation as the fancy fiddler that made everybody dance and the fireman than being caring and loving to his own wife. And that was important because in the sequel, we see more of Patty's dark side.
Well, having known a few Irishmen in my life, they tend to be charming, correct? They are often very charming. Great gift of gab, great storytellers, joke deliverers, and all that. You must have had some of that in mind when you created these characters.
Oh, I've known some Irishmen in my life too. And yeah, they, as I described Patty, he thought a wink and a smile made it all better.
Yeah.
And but their life gets, they face some obstacles, and he's challenged about whether he has the ability, the strength, the inner strength to face the obstacles and move in a positive way.
So when did you decide to write the sequel? Were you always planning to write a sequel?
No, I wasn't. I ended this book with a cliffhanger, so I wanted the reader to figure it out for themselves. They could decide. But so many people wanted to know what happened to these characters. So many people just want to know more about these characters, and you can see in the reviews, we want more. So I wrote it at the urging of people asking me to write more about these characters. People were wondering about them.
So what did you learn about writing? We talked about the idea of using the person's actual voice rather than the narrator. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, as I said earlier, I don't know if it was a classic style, but I felt I was writing in the omniscient voice, and I just felt in Charles Brennan's case, I would go to bed at night and think, how am I going to give him, how are people going to know why he was like he was? Because no one else knew but him. He never told anybody about his past. He was too, not ashamed, too proud. And so I decided I woke up and I said, I'll give him his own voice. And so he tells his own story. And again, that humanized him in a lot of ways, because you realize that he was a child who was unloved and abused. And then that sort of became the vehicle I used for some of the other characters to get more insight into them. I read a lot about developing characters, and I felt it was the best way for us to understand that Katie was reluctant in her coming to America, and her only goal was to return. Whereas Mara was seeking the American dream. She wanted the husband and the children and him to have a wonderful job in America. Their goals were very different, although they were very close. Their goals were very different.
You know, I'm thinking, I like to talk about books a lot, but as you're speaking, I'm thinking of Brooklyn by Colin Toybin. That character, did she want to come? I know she had a tough time in the boarding house that she lived in and fitting in and all of that.
I hadn't heard of that movie until people read this and it reminded them, so I did watch it after that, and I saw the similarities. It was, I think it was a little later. The era was a little bit later.
A little more modern.
Than 1868.
Yeah, because she worked in a department store. And, but if anybody's looking for another very good Irish writer, Colm, C-O-L-M-T-O-I-B-I-N, I think is how he, how it's spelled, and they did make an Academy Award-winning movie out of Brooklyn, and there are others. So we didn't talk about Mrs. Brennan, who gave you the opportunity to bring in some other women's and sexual issues into the story. So
it was the Victorian era. And I almost put a teacup on the cover because I thought of Mrs. Brennan, and actually he refers to Mr. Brennan refers to her as a porcelain. He had a business and he was making money, but he was still very rough around the edges. He still had his Cockney accent and he didn't have good manners. And he he was striving for acceptance and respectability. And he thought he could find that by marrying somebody who was refined and who came from a good background. And he met Rose. And Rose had her needs as well. She was a woman whose father had died. She was alone in the world. And it seemed like, and she was a little older, and it seemed like a good opportunity for her to have a family.
Well, and she is also abused in many ways, but comes out of it stronger. And I'm looking forward to finding more about her. I think she was probably a strong character in
the day of this book. There was a woman could not divorce a man, and if the man divorced her, he would put her to the streets, and that's how Mr. Brennan controlled Rose. But you will see Rose has potential. She's not a fine piece of porcelain, as he thought.
There's quite a plot twist there, but I was we didn't get a chance to have you read, but I'm going to read this one sentence about Rose. I've often wondered what my father would have advised me. He raised me as an equal to men. There is no equality in marriage. The role of the wife is to reproduce children, be dutiful to her husband, and comply to his rules. So that was common then. I guess what struck me was that her father was as advanced as he was. And that being said, we are out of time. There are so many topics to discuss, and I want to urge people to go to your website, joannecparsons.com. Is that you can order the book from Amazon
or
and Barnes and Nobles, and you can get a Kindle edition at any point. So good luck with both
thank
of
you very
them,
much.
and
It's been a pleasure.
continue to enjoy. And I look forward to reading the next book. Thank you so much,
Hope you enjoy
Joanne.
it. Thank you.
You're welcome.